Hi, we continue in Acts 7 as Stephen continues his speech before the Sanhedrin, who seemingly are not perturbed, at least not out loud, by this apparently uneducated, or at least not specifically educated layperson schooling them on the Torah. So we'll continue with that in just a moment as he shifts from Joseph to Moses, as we'll look at the structure of the chapter in just a moment. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit of Acts 6 and 7, I encourage you to do so, where I go over a number of these issues, all these issues in the chapter that we'll be looking at in these two chapters. Today, we're here on the theme of Stephen's speech, which we looked at the beginning. And one of the things we've been looking at is the land and the presence of foreign land. So as we saw, Abraham was called from Mesopotamia and Joseph was in Egypt. Now Moses will have never been in the promised land. He'll be in Egypt and Midian and die on the other side of the Jordan River. So all of this is taking place outside of the land, not completely. Of course, Abraham was in the land, but much of it outside the land. That's one of the themes we'll see. And one of the elements of that theme is that God is present and visible to people within the symbols and expressions we've seen outside of Jerusalem. And that will be the key, as we'll see at the end. So as we look at the shape and keywords, I've been noting no chiastic or other formal shapes, but a paragraph by paragraph review of elements of the history here with keywords around that. So we saw with Abraham, father and patriarch throughout. Then with Joseph, we saw continuing with fathers and Egypt. Now we get to the longest section. And the section of Moses is divided into three 40-year units. And so we'll look at them in three videos that way. The first one this way, about the birth of Moses and his emergence as someone trained in the wisdom of Egypt. Then his 40 years here, where he'll end up as a resident alien in Midian, and then after the burning bush, when he'll be there to lead the liberation. And so three 40-year units, and that is symbolic in ways that we've seen other 40 years and 40 days throughout Luke and in Acts. So we'll look at it there. And then it will continue with the idolatry in the desert and the question implicitly and then explicitly about whether the temple has become an idol as well. So as we look at this, let's look at what Moses is like in Luke and what Moses is like in Acts. Let's start in Acts in chapter 6, because the charge that Stephen is allegedly defending himself against is this. We saw in 6:11, the first part, and then 6:14. They, this is to say, the members of the synagogue of the freedmen who were opposing him, they secretly instigated some men to say, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God." Of course, we've not heard Stephen speak anything until this speech, and we can decide for ourselves whether he's speaking blasphemous words against Moses or God, something, of course, that Jesus was charged with, as we'll see in just a moment. And we'll change the customs that Moses handed on to us. That will be a theme later in Acts around the question of circumcision, which we can see farther down. In fact, I'll just do the Acts part here, and we'll go back to Luke since I'm here now. We saw in Peter's speech at Pentecost, starting here in chapter 2, the prophet like me from Deuteronomy 18, and we see it again in Peter's speech a little farther down. It's not on this chart because Stephen's speech about Moses would take up as much as the rest of the chart, and we're going to look at it in a minute in the form of the shape and keywords. So the promise that the Lord your God will raise up for you from your people a prophet like me. I really want to highlight that from the beginning. Hear it from Peter's mouth, we'll hear it from Stephen's mouth. The whole argument is not that Jesus is somehow denigrating Judaism and starting a new religion called Christianity, but he's like Moses. He's precisely not against Moses or superseding Moses. He's a prophet just like Moses. He's also more than that. He's the human one. He's the Son of God. But he's not less than a prophet like Moses. Then we'll see throughout Acts the question of that, the question of whether you could not be freed from the law of Moses by previous sins. We won't get into the theology of that now, but we will when we get there. Then this question from others about circumcision. And notice the issue there is about unless you're circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. But then we'll see another time in 21, the absurd element here that Paul is teaching Judeans to forsake Moses and not be circumcised, which is never an issue for anybody, even for Paul in his letters. The question is, do non-Judeans need to be circumcised in order to join the way of Jesus? And his answer is no. But he was certainly not suggesting that Israelites, or Judaioi in this case, translated as Judeans, would need to stop circumcising their male children. And so that will be a big issue we'll see later, as if the entire relationship of Yahweh and the people was around circumcision. as if that was the measure of all things. And it's become that, at least symbolically, in many ways, in arguments between Catholics and Protestants, as a matter of whether faith is about following rules and works or about faith. And all those later arguments have tainted much of scholarship around Acts, and I'm doing my best in these videos to try to separate that so we can hear Acts on its own terms. And then finally, at the end, we see this phrase that we'll see was spoken a number of times in Luke's gospel. Moses as part of the prophets, so the prophets and Moses, that the Messiah would suffer. So the whole argument from Scripture. And when we look back there from Luke, we can see that. So right at the beginning, when the time came for their purification, which is to say Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, according to the law of Moses, and then when Jesus heals someone, he tells them, as Moses commanded, show yourself to the priest. We saw at the Transfiguration, the question of Moses and Elijah together, and then all these green ones I don't need to go over in detail, as I was just noting Moses and the prophets, Moses and the prophets, Moses and the prophets. There's the place where the Sadducees use Moses against them, at least the Torah, about the Levirate marriage, and Jesus mocks them for that. And then Jesus calls upon the burning bush story, which is also called upon by Stephen in our chapter here. So nothing against Moses throughout Luke. Nothing is certainly against Moses in Acts. They are false charges. And again, that's the irony of people coming later to believe that somehow Paul was on the side of those who were charging Stephen falsely. He is the one who will be holding their coats at the end, but of course that's before his Damascus Road experience, which happens in just a couple of chapters from now. So let's go back to our keywords rather, and we'll zoom in our immediate paragraph and we'll look at some translation issues. It begins oddly in a certain way here. Before we get to the details, Luke Johnson notes here the Lucan shaping of the narrative, looking back to Acts 7:5 around the question of the promise, which establishes a pattern of prophecy fulfillment. What he doesn't note, though, is it establishes a pattern of prophecy and fulfillment within Acts as well, that we'll see in just a moment. As the time grew near, and if you followed any of my videos or studied biblical Greek at all, you might be aware that there are two words for time in Greek, chronos and kairos. And usually chronos, the stuff you measure on a chronometer, a watch, or a calendar, is time in a quantitative sense, specific units of it, hours, days, weeks, etc. And kairos usually is the quality of time. It's the time to do something, not because of the calendar, but because of the spirit or because of other factors that lead one believe it's the time to get up, or whatever it might be. Here, it's chronos in a context that would certainly seem like it's more likely to be kairos, a special time. As my note below has, chronos is 24 times in Luke Acts and kairos 22. So they're used relatively interchangeably, despite the traditional difference in meaning of them. Fulfillment is not in the Greek here, so you can see on the right side, as the time drew near for the promise that God made to Abraham. But it's also the promise that God made to them that we see back in Acts 1:4. While staying with them, he ordered them not to leave Jerusalem, to wait there for the promise of the Father. And so the promise of the Father and the promise that God made to Abraham are obviously from the same source. And that's not all. While they were there, the people in Egypt increased and multiplied, echoing 6:7, where the people were increasing, which is what led to the appointment of the 7 in the first place, that they didn't have enough staff, so to speak, enough ministers to account for the needs. And so the promise to the people in Acts, they're increasing just like the Israelites are in the story that Stephen is portraying. And there are other parallels. There's also the parallel, as we'll see momentarily, between Moses and Jesus. There's also the parallel between Stephen and Jesus particularly. So a number of interesting subtexts going on here. So the people in Egypt are increasing and multiplying, following from Exodus 1:7, the Septuagint, as you can see down below. Keener notes part of Luke's expansion of, quote, God's people beyond Israel, end quote, suggesting that Luke saw the Pentateuchal expansion of God's people as a pattern for the expansion of God's message among people in Luke's own time. And that certainly seems to be the case, because as we'll see about Moses, one of the curious things is we can call him an Israelite, but he never sets foot in the land of Israel or Judah, not even once. He only exists in Egypt and Midian and in the wilderness. So he continues the story here, this transition from Joseph to Moses. The people are increasing until another king who had not known Joseph ruled over Egypt, or literally stood up, as I have on the right side there, as you can see following Exodus 1:8. And then we see an interesting subtext of contrasting wisdom, which is in Exodus as well. So he dealt craftily, using the word katasophisomenos here, only here in the New Testament, but literally meaning according to wisdom. You can see sophis here for like Sophia, and we saw that Stephen was full of wisdom, and we're going to see that Moses, you can see on the left side, instructed in the wisdom of Egypt. So there's the Egyptian wisdom, there's the wisdom of the Spirit, and there's the Egyptian wisdom, what I would call the wisdom of the religion of empire, or royal wisdom, as people like the great saintly Walter Brueggemann had called it. So we dealt with a certain kind of wisdom with our interestingly translated race here for genos. It's anachronistic in our sense of race. Many lexicons refer to it as nation or kind, and that's where I made it here with our family. So, and forced our ancestors to abandon their infants so they would die, which is a very curious way of telling the story. Whereas in Exodus, the story is he told the Egyptians that any baby boy of the Israelites should be thrown in the Nile. The Egyptian collaboration with this, in fact, the Egyptian execution of the babies, is left out here, and suggesting it's the Israelites themselves that were forced somehow, without saying how, by Pharaoh to expose, not to abandon their infants as such, but to expose them. Ektheta here, only here in the Greek Bible. But to Luke's Roman audience, that would be very familiar to their practice often of abandoning infants that they couldn't afford or didn't want for whatever reasons. And so the word for forced here, kakao, can mean injured or literally to treat evilly here. And it's the first, we saw it in 7:6, we see it here, and we'll see it a number of times later. To abandon their infants, and infants is brephe, as we saw infants like the baby Jesus infant earlier. And at this time, here it's Kairos. So it was Chronos up here, and now it's Kairos. So at this auspicious time, one might say, Moses was born. As Luke Johnson notes, Luke uses the classic biographical triad of birth, nurture, and education, as he also will of Paul. Whether we think that's Luke doing it here or Stephen doing it, you can decide for yourself. But here it is. So at this Kairos, Moses was born, and he was beautiful before God. Esteas here, only Hebrews 11:23 elsewhere in the New Testament, but following the Septuagint of Exodus 2:2, the New RSV simply refers to him as a fine baby. Luke adds of God here, or before God, not the word used for Saul, who's described as tall, and David as good-looking here. And for 3 months he was brought up in his father's house. Notice no mention of his mother. And in Exodus, one of the key scenes is Moses' mother and his sister conspiring with Pharaoh's daughter across class and ethnicity, and language presumably too, to save a baby's life, especially one who her father had ordered to be killed. And so we see nothing about that here. All the women are left out of Stephen's story, even though they're included in the Exodus story. Perhaps it's because he's appealing to his audience in a patriarchal sense, having called them men, brothers, and fathers. So perhaps he doesn't want to arouse them over issues that are not directly relevant. It's hard to know, to argue from silence. So for these 3 baby months, he was brought up in his father's house. Notice there's no sense that he was circumcised. Given the role of circumcision later, there's no sense here that he was circumcised. The word for brought up here, anastrepho, here can also mean taught by. It's not in Luke's gospel. Again, in his father's house, the father's theme here, and the house theme will come up later. And then it jumps to this scene here. Again, nothing about the ark and nothing about the Nile. When he was abandoned, using a different word for abandoned here, ekthathentos here, sometimes translated as explained, but literally means to put out. So explained as in like putting out a message, but it can also mean putting someone out of your house. So in this case, putting out of the family. And it's presented as if it's just being done there, as if it's their choice to do, even though it says that Pharaoh forced them. So Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him as her own son. Notice there's no sense of Moses' mother at all, no sense of collaboration, no sense of her being hired as a nurse at all. He's simply an Egyptian here. Having only been in his family house for 3 months, he is being brought up as an Egyptian. The word for adopted here, from the root nereo, literally means to take up. But the term in Luke Acts, according to Keener here, 17 times otherwise in Acts and 2 in Luke, means to kill, in the sense of take up as in death. It could fit a context of infanticide here, reflecting negatively on Pharaoh's daughter, but as Keener notes, it doesn't fit the context here or the background. So as her own son, similarly to Joseph's sons, and we'll be told later that he had 2 sons here who are also parallel to Joseph's sons in Egypt. And so we'll complete our first unit here. And this is where we see we can read this as well as a parable about Stephen and his accusers parallel to the wicked tenants. But before we do that, we can see how the element here of Moses instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians brings up Keener's little chart here about the parallels between Moses and Jesus. although here plainly Moses is instructed in the wisdom of Egypt, not in the biblical wisdom of his ancestors there. So interesting parallels at many levels here. And so if you look at my note down below, we can see this is combining what I just noted from Keener's with some other elements. So you can see that both powerful in word and deed, as I was just noting, and both are Israelites, even though Moses is never in Israel, as I was noting. As Moses struck the Egyptians, Stephen defeats those from the synagogue of freedmen who oppose him. Both try to rescue their people on behalf of God, but are misunderstood. Both have their authority challenged by those whose jealousy blinds them, and both are rhetorically accused of wanting to kill the challenger. And this last piece works ironically the other way too. Stephen can speak in 728 against his accusers too. So there are many levels in which it's going in many different directions. The word for instructed here, the verb paideo, is a key one for Luke's audience because, as I've been noting throughout the whole Luke Acts series, in many ways what Luke is doing in his Gospel and Acts is an alternative paideia to that of the Greco-Roman status quo, which is to say paideia is the form of education for young elite members of the Roman world to train them to take their place in the empire. And he's offering a different kind of paideia that would train them to take a place within the world of Jesus' community. Here, Moses is instructed in the wisdom of Egypt to be a son of a Pharaoh and be powerful in his words and deeds. Like in Luke 24:19, a prophet powerful in words and deeds on the road to Emmaus is Jesus. And like Stephen, who we said was powerful, if not in words and deeds, doing signs and wonders. Only here is Moses described as powerful as word. We know his many deeds, raising his staff up with God's support, of course, parting the Red Sea, etc. And the word for deeds here, gois, or works, will contrast, as we'll see in 741, with bad deeds that we'll see there. So that completes the first unit of Moses, and then we'll see what happens when he begins to recognize his brothers for reasons we can't know, given he was only amongst his family for his first 3 months. We'll continue there next time. See you then. Bye-bye.